The crystalline walls of the Galactic Court of Justice gleamed under the artificial suns of Nexus Prime, their surface reflecting the faces of beings from 100 worlds who had gathered to witness what many called the trial of the century. Celeste Thorne sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the chaos swirling around her. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver from months of stress, caught the light as she turned to search the packed gallery for one face that mattered more than all the others. There, in the third row, sat her son Marcus. At 17, he possessed the same intelligent green eyes that had once earned her recognition as the galaxy's leading xenobiologist. Now those eyes were filled with tears he refused to shed, his jaw clenched with the stubborn determination she recognized as her own. He had grown taller in the months since her arrest, his shoulders broader, forced to mature too quickly by circumstances neither of them could have anticipated. The defendant will rise, intoned Judge Valorian, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over countless cases involving interstellar disputes. The judge's species, the Cytherians, were known for their impartiality, their blue-tinted skin and silver eyes lending them an otherworldly appearance that commanded respect across the galaxy. Celeste stood gracefully, her posture straight despite the weight of accusation that had been bearing down on her for nearly a year. The charges were severe: sabotage of the Andorian peace accords, terrorism, and the deaths of 47 diplomats from 12 different worlds. The evidence, while circumstantial, painted a damning picture of a brilliant scientist who had allegedly used her access to biological research to create a weapon that devastated the peace negotiations. Prosecutor Nix, a sharp-featured woman from the Terran colonies, approached the bench with predatory grace. Her reputation for securing convictions was legendary, and she had built her career on high-profile cases that shaped galactic policy. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "the evidence is clear. The defendant had motive, means, and opportunity. Her research into adaptive pathogens gave her the knowledge to create the bioweapon that turned what should have been a celebration of peace into a tragedy that claimed dozens of lives." The holographic displays around the courtroom flickered to life, showing images from the fateful day 6 months ago when the peace summit had descended into chaos. Celeste watched the familiar footage with a heavy heart, seeing again the moment when delegates began collapsing, their bodies racked by a mysterious illness that seemed to target specific genetic markers. The weapon had been sophisticated, designed to affect only certain species while leaving others untouched, creating suspicion and fear that shattered any hope of lasting peace. The defendant's own research notes, Nix continued, gesturing to floating text that appeared in the air above the courtroom, showed detailed analysis of the exact genetic sequences that were targeted. She had been studying these patterns for months before the attack, claiming it was for peaceful purposes while secretly developing the most insidious weapon in galactic history. Celeste's defense attorney, an elderly Vulcan named Counselor Brix, rose to object. His species was known for their logical approach to legal matters, their tall, thin frames and elongated skulls housing brilliant minds that could dissect complex arguments with surgical precision. "Your Honor, correlation does not imply causation. My client's research was conducted openly, published in peer-reviewed journals, and aimed at developing medical treatments for genetic disorders. The prosecution has failed to provide any direct evidence linking her to the creation or deployment of this weapon." But Celeste could see in the faces of the jury, beings from a dozen different worlds, that the damage had already been done. The political pressure to find someone responsible for the attack was immense. 3-star systems had already withdrawn from the Galactic Alliance, and tensions were rising across the galaxy. Someone had to pay for the failure of the peace process, and she had become the perfect scapegoat. As the trial progressed over the following days, witness after witness took the stand. Security footage showed her presence at the summit, her access to restricted areas, and her interactions with key delegates. But no one had seen her deploy any weapon, and the forensic evidence was frustratingly inconclusive. The bioweapon itself had been engineered to degrade rapidly, leaving behind only trace elements that could have come from any number of sources. Marcus attended every day of the trial, his presence a constant source of strength for his mother. During breaks, they would speak in hushed tones, his youthful optimism gradually giving way to the harsh reality of galactic politics. He had inherited her scientific mind, and even at 17, he could see the holes in the prosecution's case. But he was also learning that truth and justice were not always the same thing. "Mom," he whispered during one such break, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "This isn't right. They don't have proof. They can't convict you." Without proof, Celeste reached out to touch his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Sometimes, my dear boy, the galaxy needs someone to blame more than it needs the truth. I just want you to know that no matter what happens, I love you, and I'm innocent." The words hung between them like a promise, a declaration that would sustain them both through the dark days ahead. Marcus nodded, his young face set with determination that surprised even his mother. There was something in his eyes, a spark of resolve that spoke of plans already forming in his brilliant mind. The final day of the trial arrived with the weight of inevitability. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with billions more watching. The live broadcast across the galaxy. The peace that had once seemed within reach now felt like a distant dream, and the verdict would determine not just Celeste's fate, but the future of interstellar relations. Judge Valorian's voice carried across the silent courtroom as he delivered the jury's decision. On the charge of sabotage of the Andorian peace accords, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of terrorism, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one driving him deeper into his seat. Around him, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests, but all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. His mother stood motionless at the defendant's table, her back straight, her dignity intact even in defeat. "The sentence," Judge Valorian continued, his voice cutting through the noise, "is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served at the maximum security facility on Titan 7. As the guards moved to escort Celeste from the courtroom, she turned one last time to look at her son. Their eyes met across the chaos, and in that moment, she saw something that filled her with both pride and concern. Marcus was no longer the boy she had raised, but a young man with fire in his eyes and justice in his heart. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was Marcus standing in the gallery, his hand pressed against his heart in a gesture they had shared since he was small. But now it carried new meaning, a promise that their story was far from over. Outside the courthouse, as the crowds dispersed and the news feeds moved on to other stories, a young man with intelligent green eyes stood alone in the artificial twilight of Nexus Prime. Marcus Thorne had just watched his mother convicted of crimes she didn't commit, but he had also just discovered his purpose in life. The truth was out there, somewhere in the vast expanse of the galaxy, and he would find it. No matter how long it took, no matter what it cost, he would prove his mother's innocence and expose the real criminals who had destroyed the peace and ruined so many lives. The trial was over, but the real fight was just beginning. 3 years had passed since the verdict that shattered Marcus Thorne's world, and the mining colony of Kepler's Edge had become his refuge from a galaxy that branded him the son of a terrorist. The remote outpost clung to the surface of a barren asteroid in the outer rim, its domed habitats connected by pressurized tunnels that snaked across the rocky terrain like metallic veins. Here, among the outcasts and fortune seekers who carved precious minerals from dead rock, Marcus had learned to disappear. The data analysis center where he worked occupied the lower levels of Habitat 7, its servers humming constantly as they processed mining surveys and shipping manifests for the colonial administration. Marcus sat hunched over his workstation, his fingers dancing across holographic displays with practiced efficiency. At 20, he had grown into his father's tall frame, though his mother's sharp intellect blazed behind eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. "Another thrilling day in paradise," muttered Finn Garrett, the graying supervisor who had given Marcus a chance when no one else would. The older man limped past, with a steaming cup of synthetic coffee, his prosthetic leg clicking against the metal flooring. "You're pulling double shifts again, kid. That's not healthy." Marcus barely looked up from his screens, where columns of shipping data scrolled past in an endless stream. "Sleep is overrated," he replied, though the dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. "Besides, someone needs to keep track of all this cargo moving through the system. Amazing how much mining equipment requires military-grade encryption." Finn paused, his weathered face creasing with concern. Over the past year, he had watched Marcus evolve from a broken young man, seeking anonymity, into something more dangerous, someone with purpose. "You're not just analyzing shipping data, are you?" Before Marcus could answer, an alert chimed on his personal communicator. A message had arrived through one of the dozen encrypted channels he monitored, each one carefully constructed to avoid detection by galactic intelligence services. This particular signal came from a contact he had been cultivating for months, someone who claimed to have information about his mother's case. The message was brief: "Cargo Bay 7, midnight. Come alone." Marcus's heart rate quickened. For 3 years, he had been building a network of contacts across the galaxy, using his skills as a data analyst to trade information and favors. Most leads had proven worthless, but this contact, who used only the initials Z had provided, verified intelligence about corporate corruption and government cover-ups. If Z wanted to meet in person, it meant something significant had developed. As midnight approached, Marcus made his way through the colony's dimly lit corridors, past the cantinas where off-duty miners drowned their sorrows, and the shops that sold overpriced supplies to desperate workers. Cargo Bay 7 sat at the edge of the colonial complex, used primarily for storing equipment bound for the outer mining platforms. He found the bay dark except for the emergency lighting that cast long shadows between towering storage containers. The air recyclers hummed overhead, creating a steady backdrop of white noise that would mask quiet conversation. Marcus checked his chronometer, 12:03 a.m., and wondered if his contact had changed their mind. "You're late," a voice said from the shadows between the containers. Marcus turned to see a woman emerge from the darkness, her movements fluid and confident despite the poor lighting. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with short black hair and olive skin that spoke of Mediterranean ancestry. Her clothing was practical but well-made, the kind of gear favored by journalists who worked in dangerous places. "You must be Z," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. "Though I'm guessing that's not your real name." The woman smiled, extending her hand. "Zara Voss, freelance journalist. I've been investigating corporate malfeasance in the Outer Rim for the past 5 years. Your mother's case caught my attention because it doesn't fit the pattern." Marcus felt a spark of hope he had learned to suppress. "What do you mean?" Zara activated a small holographic projector, filling the space between them with floating data streams. "I've been tracking weapons shipments and biotech transfers across the galaxy, looking for patterns in corporate warfare. Your mother was convicted of creating a bioweapon that targeted specific genetic markers." "Right, that's what they claimed," Marcus replied, studying the data with practiced eyes. "But her research was focused on medical applications, not weapons development." "Exactly," Zara said, highlighting certain entries in the data stream. "But look at this. 3 months before the Peace Summit, there was a massive purchase of genetic sequencing equipment by a shell company linked to Nexus Dynamics, the same company that had contracts to provide security for the summit." Marcus's breath caught. Nexus Dynamics was one of the largest defense contractors in the galaxy, with close ties to several planetary governments. If they were involved in weapons development, it would explain why the case against his mother had been rushed through the courts with such unusual speed. "There's more," Zara continued, calling up another set of files. "I've been tracking a man named Cale Draven. He was a mid-level executive at Nexus Dynamics during the time of the summit, but he's risen rapidly through the ranks since then. He's now a senator representing the Centauri colonies, and he's been pushing for increased military spending and expanded conflict with non-aligned systems." The pieces began falling into place in Marcus's mind. Someone with access to advanced biotech, political connections, and a motive to prevent peace. Someone who needed a scapegoat to cover their tracks. You think Draven was behind the attack? I think your mother was framed, Zara said simply. But proving it won't be easy. The evidence was buried deep, and most of the witnesses have either disappeared or died in convenient accidents. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the cargo bay. Zara immediately shut down her projector and motioned for silence. Pressing herself against the nearest container, Marcus followed her lead, his heart pounding as three figures in colonial security uniforms entered the bay, sweep the area, one of them ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The surveillance grid picked up unauthorized access to this bay. Marcus recognized the voice security chief Torres, a man known for his zealous enforcement of colonial regulations. If Torres was personally involved in the search, it meant someone important was asking questions about Marcus's activities. The security team moved methodically through the bay, their helmet lights cutting through the darkness as they checked behind containers and equipment racks. Marcus pressed himself deeper into the shadows, barely breathing as one of the officers passed within arm's reach of his hiding spot. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the security team completed their sweep and departed, leaving the bay in darkness once again. Zara waited several more minutes before emerging from her hiding place, her expression grim. "They're watching you," she said quietly. "Which means someone knows you've been asking questions about your mother's case." Marcus nodded, his mind already racing through the implications. If his activities had attracted official attention, his time on Kepler's edge was limited. But more importantly, it meant they were onto something significant enough to warrant surveillance. "I have a ship," Zara continued, pulling out a small device that projected a star chart. "Nothing fancy, but it's fast and equipped with military-grade jamming systems. If you're serious about clearing your mother's name, we need to leave tonight." Marcus stared at the star chart, seeing routes that led away from the safety of exile toward dangers he could barely imagine. For 3 years, he had dreamed of this moment, the chance to actively pursue the truth instead of just gathering information from the shadows. But leaving Kepler's edge meant abandoning the life he had built, however humble it might be. "What about Captain Riven?" Zara asked, noting his hesitation. "You mentioned him in your encrypted messages." Marcus smiled despite the tension. Jace Riven was a smuggler who operated on the fringes of galactic law, someone who had become an unlikely friend during Marcus's time on the colony. The captain had been investigating shipping anomalies for his own reasons, and his ship could provide the mobility they would need to pursue leads across multiple star systems. "Jace has been tracking illegal weapons shipments," Marcus explained. "He lost his brother in a corporate raid 5 years ago, and he's been looking for payback ever since. If we can prove Nexus Dynamics was involved in weapons trafficking, he'll want in." Zara nodded approvingly. 3 investigators are better than 2, and we'll need all the help we can get if we're going up against a galactic corporation and a sitting senator. As they prepared to leave the cargo bay, Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. For 3 years, he had been content to gather information and wait for the right opportunity. Now that opportunity had arrived, bringing with it the promise of truth and the threat of death. He thought of his mother, alone in her cell on Titan 7, maintaining her dignity despite the injustice that had been done to her. She had always taught him that truth was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. "All right," Marcus said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "Let's go find Captain Riven. It's time to take this fight." The Vagrant's dream cut through hyperspace like a silver needle, its modified engines pushing the boundaries of what the aging freighter was designed to handle. In the ship's cramped common area, Zara Voss spread holographic files across the central table while Captain Jace Riven nursed a cup of real coffee, a luxury he reserved for special occasions. Marcus stood at the viewport, watching the swirling patterns of hyperspace, while his mind processed the information they had gathered over the past 2 weeks. "Tell me again why we're risking our necks to interview a dead woman," Jace said, his weathered face creased with skepticism. The captain was a man in his 40s who had spent most of his adult life in the gray areas between legal and illegal commerce. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from the corporate raid that had killed his brother. Zara looked up from her files, her dark eyes bright with the intensity that had made her one of the galaxy's most respected investigative journalists. "Because Thea Morwen isn't dead," she said, highlighting a series of shipping records on the holographic display. "She's supposed to be dead. There's a difference." Marcus turned from the viewport, his attention caught by the certainty in Zara's voice. "Explain." "Thea was a research assistant at the Kepler Institute," Zara began, calling up a personnel file that showed a young woman with auburn hair and intelligent brown eyes. "She worked directly under your mother on the genetic sequencing project that the prosecution claimed was used to develop the bioweapon. 3 days after testifying at the trial, her transport ship suffered a catastrophic engine failure. The holographic display shifted to show the wreckage of a civilian transport, its hull twisted and blackened by what appeared to be an internal explosion. Marcus had seen the report during his mother's trial, another tragic accident that had eliminated a key witness who might have provided testimony favorable to the defense. "But here's what's interesting," Zara continued, manipulating the display to show shipping manifests and passenger logs. "Thea Morwen officially died in that explosion, but someone matching her description and using forged identification has been spotted on 3 different worlds over the past 2 years. She's been moving through the Outer Rim colonies, staying in places where questions aren't asked and records aren't kept." Jace leaned forward, his interest piqued. "How do you know it's really her?" Zara smiled, calling up a series of surveillance images that showed a woman who bore a strong resemblance to the personnel file, though her hair was now black and she appeared to have undergone minor facial reconstruction. Facial recognition is tricky when someone's had cosmetic surgery, but there are biological markers that are harder to change. Gait analysis, voice patterns, even the way someone holds their shoulders when they walk. Marcus studied the images, noting the subtle similarities that Zara had identified. If she's alive and hiding, it means someone wanted her dead badly enough to fake her murder. That suggests she knows something that could damage the real perpetrators. "Exactly," Zara said. "And according to my sources, she's currently on Meridian Station, working under the name Luna Vega as a maintenance technician. The station is owned by Stellar Logistics, which has contracts with Nexus Dynamics." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The woman who might hold the key to exposing Nexus Dynamics was hiding under the nose of one of their subsidiary companies, probably figuring it was the last place anyone would look for her. "Meridian Station is a fortress," Jace warned, calling up a schematic of the massive orbital facility. 20,000 people live and work there, and security is tighter than a banker's purse. Getting in won't be easy, and getting out with a reluctant witness will be even harder. Marcus studied the station's layout, noting the multiple security checkpoints and the heavy presence of corporate security forces. But his years of analyzing data had taught him to look for patterns and weaknesses that others might miss. "There," he said, pointing to a section of the station's outer ring. "The maintenance levels. They have their own docking ports for service vessels, and the security is lighter because most of the work is automated. If Thea is working as a maintenance tech, that's probably where we'll find her." Zara nodded approvingly. "That matches the intelligence I've gathered. She's been assigned to the water reclamation systems on level 7. It's isolated, dangerous work that most people avoid." As the Vagrant's dream dropped out of hyperspace, near Meridian Station, the massive structure filled their view screen like a metallic flower blooming against the stars. The station's rotating sections created artificial gravity for its inhabitants, while fixed central spires housed the docking facilities and administrative centers. It was a marvel of engineering that represented the height of corporate efficiency and the depths of corporate control. "Remember," Jace said as he maneuvered their ship toward one of the maintenance docks, "we're independent contractors hired to inspect water filtration systems. Keep your heads down, don't attract attention, and try not to get us all killed." The docking process went smoothly, with their forged credentials passing the automated security checks without triggering any alarms. Marcus had spent considerable time and resources acquiring identification that would hold up to casual scrutiny, though he hoped they wouldn't need to undergo deep background verification. The maintenance levels of Meridian Station were a stark contrast to the gleaming public, areas where tourists and business travelers mingled. Here, the corridors were functional and utilitarian, with exposed pipes and conduits running along the walls. The air carried the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere and the constant hum of machinery that kept the station operational. They found Thea Morwin, or Luna Vega, as she was now known, in a cramped maintenance shaft deep in the station's infrastructure. She was wearing a standard technician's jumpsuit and had her hair tied back in a practical ponytail as she worked on a complex array of filtration equipment. When she looked up and saw three strangers in her workspace, her face went pale with recognition and fear. "You're Marcus Thorne," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of rushing water. "You look just like your mother." Marcus stepped closer, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. "Thea, we need to talk about what really happened at the Peace Summit, about who really created that bioweapon." Thea's hands shook as she set down her tools, and Marcus could see the weight of 3 years of hiding and fear in her eyes. She had been young when she worked with his mother, probably no more than 25, but the stress of living under a false identity had aged her prematurely. "They told me I was dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said it was the only way to keep me safe, but I've been watching the news feeds, and I know your mother is still in prison for something she didn't do." Zara activated a small recording device, its presence causing Thea to flinch. "We're not here to hurt you," Zara said softly. "We're here to give you a chance to tell the truth, to set the record straight." For a long moment, Thea stared at the recording device as if it were a weapon pointed at her heart. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "Your mother's research was pure," she said, looking directly at Marcus. "Everything she did was aimed at developing treatments for genetic disorders. But someone else had access to our lab, someone with authorization, codes that came from the highest levels of the Institute." "Who?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Cale Draven," Thea replied, the name falling from her lips like a curse. "He visited the lab regularly, claimed he was conducting oversight on behalf of the funding committee. But I saw him copying our research, taking samples of our work. When I tried to report it to the director, I was told to mind my own business." Zara leaned forward, her journalist's instincts sensing a crucial detail. "Did you see what he was copying specifically?" Thea nodded, her confidence growing as she shared the burden she had carried for so long, the genetic sequencing data for the species that were targeted in the attack. He was particularly interested in Andorian and Tellurite genetic markers, the exact profiles that were hit by the bioweapon. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Draven had used his position to steal Celest's research, weaponized it, and then used the attack to advance his own political career while destroying the woman whose work had made it possible. "There's more," Thea continued, her voice growing stronger. "The night before the summit, Draven visited the lab one last time. He was carrying a sealed container, and he had 2 security guards with him. They made me leave while he accessed the main research files." Marcus felt a surge of anger and hope. This was the evidence they needed, direct testimony from someone who had witnessed Draven's involvement. But he also knew that getting Thea to safety and convincing her to testify publicly would be the greatest challenge they had faced yet. "Will you help us?" he asked. "Will you tell the galaxy what really happened?" Thea looked around the cramped maintenance shaft that had been her world for the past 3 years, then back at the 3 people who represented her only chance at redemption. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said, "it's time to stop running." As they prepared to leave Meridian Station with their precious witness, none of them noticed the security camera that had been Tr. Senator Cale Draven stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office on Centauri Prime, watching the twin suns cast long shadows across the planet's gleaming capital city. At 45, he had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of: wealth, power, and influence that stretched across star systems. His reflection in the polished glass showed a man who had been crafted for politics. Silver-touched dark hair, sharp features that conveyed both intelligence and authority, and eyes that could shift from warm sincerity to cold calculation depending on his audience. The secure communication device on his desk chimed with an urgent message. Draven turned from the window and activated the holographic display, revealing the concerned face of Director Vex, his head of corporate security operations. "Senator," Vex began, his scarred features tense with worry, "we have a problem. The Morwen woman has been contacted by Marcus Thorne and a journalist named Zara Voss. Our surveillance on Meridian Station captured their entire conversation." Draven's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the glass of Centauri wine he had been holding. "I thought Thea Morwen was dead." "She was supposed to be," Vex replied, his discomfort evident. "The transport explosion was staged to convince everyone she had been eliminated. But we kept her alive as insurance. She's been under monitoring on Meridian Station for the past 3 years, and now she's talking to the son of the woman I destroyed," Draven said, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that his subordinates had learned to fear. "How delightfully poetic." The senator moved to his desk, where holographic displays showed real-time updates from across the galaxy. Stock prices, political polls, military deployments, all the information that helped him maintain his carefully constructed empire of influence. But now that empire faced its greatest threat not from rival politicians or corporate competitors, but from the truth. "Sir," Vex continued, "our assets are in position to eliminate all 3 targets. We can make it look like a transport accident, just like with the others." Draven waved a dismissive hand. The others were small-time witnesses, easily erased without drawing attention. But Marcus Thorne has been building a network for 3 years, and Zara Voss is a prominent journalist. Their deaths would create investigations, questions we can't afford to answer. The senator activated another communication channel, connecting to a secure facility hidden in the asteroid belt beyond Centauri Prime. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to Dr. Helena Cross, a brilliant but ruthless geneticist who had been instrumental in weaponizing Celeste Thorne's research. "Helena," Draven said, his tone shifting to the persuasive warmth he used when he needed cooperation rather than obedience. "I need you to prepare for a possible acceleration of our timeline." Dr. Cross raised an eyebrow, her pale features framed by stark white hair that made her appear older than her 40 years. "The Titan project isn't ready for full deployment. We need at least 6 more months to complete the genetic targeting protocols. Events are moving faster than anticipated," Draven explained, calling up surveillance footage that showed Marcus, Zara, and Thea leaving Meridian Station aboard the Vagrant's Dream. "Our old friend Celeste Thorne may soon have her vindication, which means we need to demonstrate why our work was necessary in the first place." The Titan project was Draven's masterpiece, a bioweapon far more sophisticated than the crude device that had disrupted the Endorian peace accords, where the original weapon had targeted specific genetic markers. Titan could be programmed to affect any biological profile, creating the perfect tool for selective genocide disguised as natural plague. The plan was to deploy it against one of the non-aligned worlds that refused to join the Centauri coalition, providing the justification for expanded military action and increased defense contracts. "If we deploy prematurely," Dr. Cross warned, "there's a chance the weapon could mutate beyond our control parameters. The genetic locks might fail." Draven's smile was cold and predatory. "Risk has always been part of progress, Helena. Besides, if the weapon spreads beyond our intended targets, it will only serve to demonstrate the danger posed by uncontrolled genetic research. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to make it bigger." As he ended the communication, Draven reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. His rise to power had been carefully orchestrated over 2 decades, beginning with his work at Nexus Dynamics and culminating in his election to the Galactic Senate. Every step had been calculated to position him at the center of military-industrial influence, where he could profit from conflict while appearing to advocate for peace. The Endorian peace accords had threatened to disrupt that careful balance. If the various species of the galaxy had actually achieved lasting peace, defense spending would have plummeted, and corporations like Nexus Dynamics would have seen their profits evaporate. The bioweapon attack had been a desperate gambit to prevent that outcome, and framing Celeste Thorne had been a stroke of genius that eliminated a brilliant researcher, while discrediting genetic science in general. But now Marcus Thorne was threatening to unravel everything. The young man had inherited his mother's intelligence and coupled it with a determination that Draven found both admirable and terrifying. Worse, he had allies, people willing to risk their lives to expose the truth. Draven activated another channel, this one connecting to his office in the Galactic Senate building. His chief of staff, a efficient woman named Assistant Director Kane, appeared on the screen surrounded by the controlled chaos of a busy political operation. Kane, Draven said, "I need you to arrange a press conference for tomorrow. I'm going to announce new legislation to regulate genetic research and prevent the kind of bioweapon attacks that killed so many at the Peace Summit." Kane nodded, already making notes. "What's the angle, Senator? Are we positioning this as a response to new intelligence?" "Something like that," Draven replied. "I want to emphasize the ongoing danger posed by rogue scientists and the need for strict corporate oversight of biological research. Frame it as a memorial to the victims of the Peace Summit attack." As Kane ended the communication to begin arranging the press conference, Draven turned his attention to more immediate concerns. His security network had been tracking the Vagrant's dream since it left Meridian Station, and the ship was currently headed toward the core worlds, probably hoping to find sympathetic journalists or government officials who might listen to their story. But Draven had spent years building relationships throughout the galactic government, and very few officials would be willing to challenge his version of events. Without overwhelming proof, Marcus Thorne and his allies would find doors closed to them at every turn, their accusations dismissed as the desperate fantasies of a convicted terrorist's son. The senator moved to his private safe, entering a complex biometric code that granted access to his most sensitive files. Inside, along with various state secrets and financial records, was a small data crystal that contained the original research stolen from Celeste Thorne's laboratory. He had kept it as insurance, proof of his foresight in recognizing the military applications of seemingly peaceful genetic research. Now, looking at the crystal in the palm of his hand, Draven realized it represented both his greatest triumph and his most dangerous vulnerability. If Marcus Thorne somehow managed to prove that this research had been stolen, it would expose the entire conspiracy. But destroying the crystal would eliminate a crucial piece of evidence that might someday be needed to justify his actions. He placed the crystal back in the safe, sealing it with additional security protocols. The truth was a dangerous thing, but lies were even more fragile. The key to maintaining power was controlling which truths were allowed to surface and which remained buried. As the twin suns of Centauri Prime set beyond the horizon, casting the capital city in shades of gold and crimson, Draven began planning his counterattack. Marcus Thorne had chosen to challenge one of the most powerful men in the galaxy, and he was about to learn that some truths came with a price higher than anyone should have to pay. The senator activated one final communication channel, connecting to assets positioned throughout the core worlds. "Initiate Operation Blackout," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I want every port, every communication hub, and every news outlet monitored. When Marcus Thorne and his friends surface, I want to know about it before they draw their next breath." As confirmation signals came back from across the galaxy, Draven allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had built his empire by staying 3 steps ahead of his enemies, and he wasn't about to let the son of a discredited scientist change that now. But as he settled into his chair to review the evening's intelligence reports, a small part of his mind wondered if perhaps he had underestimated the power of truth and the determination of those willing to die for it. The game was entering its final phase, and the stakes had never been higher. Retriclod can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 4.